This is all the mountain mint. Mountain mint is terrific because the deer don't eat it. So this has been a really great first. We planted these as little plugs. A little walnut tree that volunteered that I'm going to let go right here. And I'm going to bring you over to Amanda.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to show you some really interesting flowers we have blooming. It's September 16th, and look at all this color. So right here is one of my favorite aggressive native called lavender hyssop. And even though it's almost, you can see that purple flower head, look at all those seeds in there. Look at how it has that really nice structure of the flower head. And this is going to stay standing through the winter. So that's a beautiful structure right there. But I also wanted to show you.
I want to interrupt immediately because this is also an incredibly important food source for finches in winter.
Yeah, we actually saw some, I'm like tripping over the zinnia. We saw some goldfinch flying through here last week. So plant it and they will come. I also wanted to show you, this is a blue stem goldenrod. I know that we talked about the Canada goldenrod. This one is much nicer, behaves well with others, and it's okay for a part sun environment. We do have a little canopy above us. But there's some pollinator action on this more than any of the flowers I see right now. There's a little bumblebee there, but I also saw some native bees flying around here. So that's a great plant. We also have actually right over where Murray and Filippine are standing is this little dwarf New England aster, which is about to pop. So asters are wonderful for the meadow. And then finally is this is a penstemon Husker Red. Look at this. This is a spring flowering plant. But I want to point out is that, yeah, okay, we get white flowers in the spring, but we get all this other stuff happening throughout the year, such as these gorgeous seed heads. This is the Husker Red cultivar because it has that reddish stem on it. This is a great native plant to put in any meadow. So we're gonna head back to the Q&A session.
All right, so let's head on back. One thing I'd like to point out just before we get back, everybody, is if you look, this looks kind of what some people would say, you know, messy. It's got all different kinds of grasses. It's got plenty of things like this horsetail, I think, that people consider weeds. It's got zinnia, which is not a native plant, but it's a native flower, but it's beautiful. It's got bachelor buttons. It's got a ton of different stuff. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's got so much more life and so much more biodiversity than the lawn has. And you're not having to give up your entire lawn. We're just saying give up a little bit of the lawn for wildlife.
All right.
Okay, so now we are back. Now we're going to have the conversation. I really hope this can be a conversation, and I'm going to remind people that once we're finished asking questions, we want to hear from you. And so make sure you send in those questions on the chat. So I've got a couple questions I'm going to ask both of you, and if each one of you wants to answer, or if it turns into a conversation, I think that'd be great. But why don't we start with you, Amanda? How did you get into the field? You know, what drew you to this work?
So honestly, I've always been into, I'm definitely 1000% a tree hugger, was always playing outside, actually in the woods of Bedford at my grandma's house, loved being outside, and happened to have a career in landscape architecture where I get to be outside all the time, and now I have my own company, so it's great. But I came to this career having worked in the city. I worked for the New York City Parks Department. I worked for a nonprofit. I worked for a for-profit, and such cool work was happening in the city. But not enough cool stuff was happening in the suburbs. And so I thought, okay, the nature preserve is great, but it's just not going to cut it. We need the private yard to really be this new place of modern conservation in America. It's the private yard where we can restore the habitat. And how do we do that? We use native plants as the building block for this restoration. So I came to it more as this big picture way of finding it. It wasn't like I had this aha moment and saw a butterfly and was like, I need to do this. It was more of this like logical way of if we're gonna restore nature, the backyard is the perfect place to do this. So.
Yeah. Well, one thing that actually got me really excited about the backyard is a book that everyone should read, I think, is Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home. And one of the things that Doug Tallamy pointed out was that if you want more birds, as you were saying, Filippine, you need more bird food. And what's more bird food? Insects. And what do insects like? Native plants and trees. So I'm going to put this to you, Filippine. There's a lot of discussion about native versus non-native. We have a bunch of non-native plants right behind us. I actually sought out your approval before planting the non-native plants, and you said it's fine. Tell us what you think about why it's important to at least understand the native plants, but also not be a fundamentalist about it.
Yeah, well, I think we have to realize that the landscape we live in, wherever you are on this planet, it took a long time for animals and plants to specialize in each other. And for example, there are quite a few numbers of butterflies that are species specific. That means that their larvae can only survive and grow on a very specific plant. So I think it's good to generally try to plant native. That said, there is really not a particular moment in time that we can go back to and say, now this is how nature was and this is how what we want again. This is all the plants we need and all the birds. In fact, the landscape has been evolving all the time, and the American Indians have been landscaping this country for a long time as well. So what do we refer back to exactly? That's a very difficult question already. And then the other thing is our climate is changing, which requires nature to develop again and to adjust to different circumstances. So yeah, I think we all agree that generally try to be connect as much to the wildlife that we already have with native plants, but also let's keep a discussion together about how we move forward, and maybe we need certain hybrids if the trait species won't survive to change the climate, for example. So these are things we have to seriously talk about, and I think we should be careful not to be Puritan about. Do you say Puritan? Mm-hmm. About native or non-native?
Thank you, Philippine. I think it's a really good way to approach how to do your yard. Is that you don't want to be too much of a fundamentalist. We want to experiment. We want to feel comfortable doing it. We want to demystify it, and that's part of what this whole conversation is about. So why don't you, Amanda, I'm going to put this to you. Sort of what would you recommend to people as a process for rewilding a portion of their yard?
So there's a lot of information out there on how to make a meadow, and lots of expertise out there. So I want to distill it into 10 steps that I'm definitely going to oversimplify this, but here we go. The first step is come up with a plan. Where do you want to put your meadow? Ideally, it's in a sunny location, as we have, right, as Murray has done in his yard. You want sun because then you can get a great diversity of flowers and hence a great diversity of pollinators. But you also most likely want to start small, because with every meadow comes the beautiful flowers, but also the not so great weeds, the volunteer plants that are going to try to feed themselves. Bare soil equals weeds. So I think a 10 by 10 is a great size. So figure out where you want to put this garden. Figure out, do you want to do seeds or do you want to do little baby plugs? Little baby, it's a weird industry term called a plug, but all it is a starter plant, it's a baby plant. So are you going to do your meadow with seed like Murray has done? And then add in like little pops of plugs with a mountain mint, or are you going to do all seed or all plugs? Do that in September. Now in October, rent a sod cutter. I recommend renting a sod cutter I don't know, 20, 50 bucks a day. I know Marie used a shovel and your cousin to help you.
Yeah,
That's
it was too
great.
much work. Don't do it.
So, I mean,
I'd rent a side cutter.
rent a sod cutter. Get rid of that sod, get rid of that lawn, and dispose of it on site if you can, somewhere else.
I
Now,
flipped it. I'll tell you what I did is I took the side and I just flipped it onto the grass
Oh, wow.
behind it to create even like twice as much of a dirt layer.
oh, great, that's even easier. Now, then rake that soil surface smooth. We're already on step 4, so I hope you're all there with me. Rake that to a nice smooth soil surface. And now the first thing is pop in your plugs. I recommend drift, which are just large areas of one plant, and better yet, drift of a clumping grass, such as prairie drop seed, and planting those plugs or those little baby plants 12 inches on center. So put in that drift of native grasses in first, and then take that seed mix, and this is step 6, mix the wildflower seeds all around the plugs, in the gaps around the plugs. One little tip is to mix in some play sand and to distribute your seed. So smaller seeds with the sand go first, larger seeds go second. Instead of putting the large and the small seeds together, it's more even distribution. Again, just a little pro tip. And the sand helps you see where you put the seeds in. Now you have your seeds in. Get a weed-free straw or hay. You can get it from your local farm, your local garden center. You can buy it online, and you take the hay, you put it all over your seeded areas. Already now we're at step 8, and guess what? You don't even have to water. I know that's controversial. You do not have to water a seeded garden. The seeds are so smart. These are nature's machines designed to open up at exactly the right time when there's enough moisture, enough coldness, and stratification of cold and hot. They'll know when spring is here to start opening up. So you don't even have to water. You might want to water the plugs if you're going to put plugs in. Now let's get into, okay, I walk away. It's October. I'm going to let the meadow go to sleep. We're going to go into dormancy. Things are going to start waking up year 2, April and May. What are you going to do? How are you going to maintain this amazing little piece of nature that you put in the ground? Well, guess what? It's not that hard. Year 2, you're going to have a mower, ideally electric, and you will, whenever that height of everything gets to 12 inches, mow it down to 4 or 6 inches. And you just keep mowing that first year. It's that easy. Then step 3, we're on the last step already, which is year 3 and onward. Now we're into maturity of the meadow. Now, even before year 1, year 2, I want you to get as familiar as you can with the plants. It's not just the flowers, it's the leaves too. This is a great book. Good weed, bad weed. You're going to get a lot of volunteers. You're going to get mugwort, you're going to get thistle, you're going to get silkgrass. All kinds of fun people are coming to the party. So this is going to tell you the best way to control those weeds. We don't use any chemicals at PLANitWILD. A lot of the time it is hand removal very carefully and immediately into a trash bag and not into a compost bin. What else can I say about that? That's step 10. How about this? Enjoy it. Get a cup of coffee, get a glass of wine, and watch the goldfinches.
Exactly. Well, that's great. Thank you so much, Amanda. And one other, when I was listening to that, I was thinking that I was lucky enough this spring, not lucky enough, but I was lucky to be home, even though it was terrible circumstances, which I had to be home, but that I had some extra time to put into creating this meadow. And so what about for people who might not have as much time? Filippine, what would you recommend for the person who's probably on this Zoom call now, who's thinking, that sounded like a lot, or maybe that sounds a little bit expensive. What would you recommend is the simplest way to just start on a meadow? Give us some tips.
So you described exactly me because I didn't want to do it with the money. I wanted to figure out what happens if I would just copy nature itself. So what you need to do if you copy that process is you mow and you remove the clippings. And you have to do that repeatedly. That way you create a situation where strawberry does not have a chance to grow. but you lose your carpet forming grasses. They will grow up and are being removed on a moment that they're quite tall, so they won't survive. But instead, you will get conforming grasses and then the wildflowers. As we were talking about already, like the volunteers, you will get a lot of things that you have not been planting. They will be popping up, and eventually you will see bare spots. If you have been removing the clippings often enough, the soil becomes more lean, and there's your chance to, if you want to add something to your meadow, you can. In those little bare spots, you can put some seeds or a plug, but you don't have to. If you have patience, your meadow will come into being by itself. And we have a couple of preserves here in Westchester that you can visit and see how that works. We have the Old Field Preserve and the Pine Grove Meadow Preserve, both in Wakabak. They are totally different from each other, and both took years before they became what they are. And they're beautiful. And the only thing they require is actually a yearly mow. But just by changing the time of mowing or the frequency or the season, or just doing it randomly, that way you're already changing the character of your prairie or your meadow. And that's only by mowing practices. And you're only mowing a few times a year, which is way less than you would have your landscaper over every week. So it's hugely beneficial.
Great. Thank you so much, Filippine. That's one of our goals. How do we measure a change in biodiversity over time with our meadows? And certainly what I did, not here, but at a previous place we had further north in Westchester, is I was writing down in a journal every single bird I saw, every mammal I saw, every frog, every snake, every insect, every different kind of grass, and it became overwhelming for me, every kind of fungi, mushroom. And so I discovered this app, iNaturalist, which I just would recommend if people want to have. Essentially, it will help you catalog everything that you see. It helps identify it. It helps scientists and the rest of policymakers know what's out there. But just for me personally, it's really nice to see what's here and then to be able to just measure the change over time. So if you want to measure what's in your backyard now and then make a meadow and see the difference, I bet you'll see several hundred species more in your meadow than were there previously. Anything to add about that,
Yes,
Filippine?
I think for me, it really opened up a whole different beauty in my yard. So the first years that I had a garden, I was mesmerized by all the plants that I could, care for. But once I started doing iNaturalist, those plants, they shriveled to sort of becoming a buffet for the insects. It's really awesome. It opens up another door for you if you have a good look around in your garden on a sort of microscopic level.
A great way to measure the work you've done. So we're going to move on to another part of our program, at the final part of our program, I believe. Thank you so much, Amanda and Filippine, for answering those questions. Now we have a lot of hard questions from the audience. Some of them are no surprises at all, because everyone asks these questions and they're really good ones. A couple other really specific ones, and I'm going to really look to you all to help me answer. Okay, so the first one, I'm interested to hear the answer to this question, is, and you all can probably guess it, what do we do about deer? Everyone knows that the white-tailed deer is the dominant feature on the ecosystem in the northeastern United States. The entire understory of all of the, I know, so I know you love to answer this. And so the entire understory of our forest and our yard, all of it is dominated by the browsing habits of the deer. They don't eat the invasives. They only eat the great things that we love to plant. And that is what it looks like everywhere. And so what do we do about deer? Philippine,
I just want to say, Philippine and I have been talking about deer since we first met for coffee. Literally, we're like, what do we do about deer? You have the floor. I just want to let everyone know.
Well, I think it's true. The biggest concern about deer is our understory. So what I see happening in my meadow is that they eat a little something here and there. It's fine. You see plenty enough left for your meadow to be beautiful. So if we talk about meadows, deer are not the biggest problem at all. It's really the understory, and we should actually have a whole different
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And you know, actually, you and I were talking about going on walks in parks here in Westchester and Bedford in the spring, and it's just shocking to realize that in the woods, just about the entire understory is, you know, burning bush, Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, several non-native species everywhere. And yet I agree, for my meadow here, the deer have not seemed to be too much of a problem. Amanda, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree. And if they're going to chomp away at your purple coneflower, that's fine. But let your seed stock standing so that that purple coneflower can be sure to reproduce itself through the winter. That's just the one thing I have, so that no biggie. They chomped away my purple coneflower, no biggie. It's a perennial. It's going to come up year after year because that seed is in the soil. We want that seed in the soil as much as possible, out competing the weed seed that's coming in.
So the next question is sort of specific about creating a meadow. Can I create a meadow without smothering? Can I let it go wild and then throw seed after mowing in the fall?
No, if you just mow and you have a lawn, you're just mowing the grass carpet. And seeds that you put in your grass carpet will have very little chance to grow. So you really have to defeat the sod before you start a meadow. And the feeding can be either by smothering, you can do it by pulling the sod, or by sod cutting. Some landscapers use Roundup. There are all kinds of ways to do it, but the bottom line is you have to get rid of the grass mat. The natural way again is by not mowing it. If you let grass go to seed a couple of years, it will get exhausted. They will put all its energy in growing vertically and will not sort of move horizontally anymore. So that's a really good way to wear out your grass mat. And after that, you can also see these bare spots in your lawn, and that's where you can start planting.
Great. Anything to add to that, Amanda?
Next question. I like this.
Okay, great. So how to manage weeds, especially stilt grass or knotweed?
Thing that's kind of cool about silk grass is that the roots are really shallow, so you can hand pull it. Wow. There you go. You can hand pull.
You should stick around.
Yeah, that would probably be a
She's good at
whole
that.
afternoon of just hand pulling silk grass. And I want you to again take this and carefully put it into a plastic bag that you can dispose of off site. Another option, if you don't want to hand pull, oh, and if you do hand pull, I recommend overseeding right away with an aggressive native like a Rebecca Herta or a Black-Eyed Susan, just so that, because that seed is still going to be in the ground, so at least you have a fighting chance with a very aggressive native. Another option is to weed whack it, or sorry, string trim it, and you want to do that before the Japanese Japanese silkgrass goes to flower. So these are just about to seed themselves. So you would want to do this actually back in September. Is you want to weed whack those stems all the way to the ground. You keep string trimming it all the way down, and eventually you exhaust its seed source. And again, you're overseeding with that aggressive native.
Great, thank you. Okay, so next one is, and I actually don't know the answer to this, so I'm eager if we can figure it out. Are cultivars as beneficial as native plants, or trees, or shrubs?
Generally not. It depends on for what reason they were cultivated. You can actually cultivate a plant to produce more nectar. That's possible, but generally nurseries produce or cultivate plants to make them more sellable, which means they are made to be more pretty, and that generally comes at a cost.
They did this really interesting, if you want to nerd out, there's this really interesting study they did at the Mount Cuba Center. I would Google that, where they actually looked at the pollinator action on different cultivars of New England aster and a few other kinds of plants. I just recommend looking that up.
Okay, so another question. After smothering in spring, do you recommend filling or new soil or another practice?
Spring.
I don't really understand.
After you smothered in the spring, what do you do? Another practice to then be able to sow on top.
Okay, so you put the plastic on. So there's two ways to smother. You can either put a biodegradable weed fabric on, and then if you're planting plugs, you cut into the fabric, and then you plant the plugs right in the ground. That fabric stays there. Ideally, you filled in mulch around the plug. If you're talking plastic smothering, where you're using the sun to bake everything underneath, shining through that clear plastic, baking, you then remove that plastic and you do a top coat of topsoil and put your aggressive natives in that environment.
Great. Okay, couple more questions here. Only a couple more minutes. What do you think? What about clay soil? What do you recommend that is done in clay soil? This is very rich soil here that we did this. What about clay?
Well, that's so intriguing that whatever type of soil you have, or whether you wet or sunny, dry, or this creates different types of meadows. So eventually, those that like the clay and look it up, there are plenty of terrific plant species for clay. Those that like the clay will do best and will outcompete the others. And the same is for sandy soil. You will just get very different types of meadows with very different habitats that are all serving different types of wildlife. So it's tremendously important that we have all these ecosystems.
Great, thank you. And you alluded to that, which is a meadow in shade. Again, I think that's sort of the answer to that question.
No. That's
No?
correct. Meadows
Okay.
and shade is difficult.
Meadow in shade is difficult.
Because per definition, a meadow or a prairie has no shade. Because in fact, the grazers prevent trees to come up, so there is no tree canopy. So it's actually, per definition, a non-shady area.
Right.
That said, a lot of people want something under their trees, and there's still a lot of choices for that, but you won't get a typical meadow. I think the best choices under the trees are either ground covers or sedges or ferns. So that's something you just have to talk about or look up what is best for your particular situation.
Right. I mean, a meadow, we're throwing this term around, but it means that prairie, that grassland and that wildflower mix. You can also say a meadow is just pretty plants that you're putting somewhere to replace a lawn. And so to add on to what Filippine is saying, of course, there's plenty of native plants to put in a shady area to replace lawn. We looked at one of those earlier today. That blue stem goldenrod is a great option to add that late season yellow color. But again, the ferns, the sedges, just take a walk in the woods in Westchester and look, and you'll see who's growing there. And then iNaturalist.
You'll find out it's Japanese barberry. Okay, this is a good one. I love thinking about these specific weeds because this is a very tough one for me. What do people recommend you do about mugwort?
Mugwort is that gives me nightmares.
Me too.
I see it coming up. It's kind of on the edge of Westchester. It's now moving upwards to the Catskills. It's an amazing weed. It smells deliciously, and I actually am sort of impressed by its spores. Hopefully we will find some bugs here that we can convince to eat the mugwort.
Well, this is a funny mugwort story. So mugwort is one of the toughest weeds on this property that I've seen in Westchester. A woman in the park, and a very bent over older Chinese woman who was harvesting mugwort in the park. And she said, "Oh, this is the most valuable plant. It's how I've stayed so healthy." She was in her late 80s, and because she eats mugwort for all different kinds of ailments, just goes to show that it's just about figuring out the value of these different plants.
Well, I think the issue is mugwort somewhere else on the planet is a very well-behaved plant, and nobody really took notice or is just happy with it like the Chinese humans. But here it's unconstrained, and we need to figure out a way to sort of deal with that. somehow and make it a nicer character, because I don't think at this point you can eradicate it.
Here's where I want to add in about green jobs. We were talking about this earlier as well. Right now, the typical landscaping maintenance practice is to have your gardener sit on top of a gas-powered mowing machine and mow your lawn, and that's landscaping. What we're trying to do at Planet Wild is to transition what it means to steward your land, and part of that is to actually pull weeds. To actually, instead of mowing the lawn, to have those gardeners pull weeds. So with the mugwort, it's easy to, it's a training to identify what those weeds are, but if we know what they look like, we can spend hours and hours paying people money to pull mugwort. So we're getting, we just launched our mindful maintenance program at Planet Wild with all electric mowing, but we're also including that labor to pull the weeds from your garden beds, like mugwort, like silkgrass, like Japanese knotweed, and all of those other culprits that we hear and see over and over again.
Great, thank you. And I think this is farewell from Bedford, New York. Thanks again, Filippine and Amanda. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.